The morning sun gleamed off the glass towers of downtown Atlanta as Judge Harrison stood at the corner of Peachtree Street, adjusting his tie one last time. Today wasn't just another day at work, it was the National Judicial Convention, where the country's most respected legal minds would gather to discuss the future of justice in America. Judge Harrison had been looking forward to this event for months. As a federal judge with 15 years on the bench, he had earned his place among the nation's legal elite. His rulings on civil rights cases had made headlines, and his commitment to fairness had earned him respect from both colleagues and the communities he served. He walked confidently toward the convention center, his polished shoes clicking against the sidewalk. The massive building loomed ahead, its entrance decorated with banners welcoming judges, attorneys, and legal scholars from across the country. Security was tight, metal barriers lined the sidewalks, and uniformed officers patrolled the perimeter. As Judge Harrison approached the VIP entrance, he noticed two police officers standing guard. Officers Bradley and Thompson had been assigned to this post early that morning. They were supposed to check credentials and ensure only authorized personnel entered through this restricted access point. Judge Harrison reached into his jacket pocket for his official ID and convention pass. He had done this countless times before at various legal conferences. But today, something was different. The moment the officers spotted him, their postures changed. Their eyes narrowed, and their hands moved closer to their equipment belts. "Sir, this entrance is for convention attendees only," Officer Bradley called out, stepping forward to block Judge Harrison's path. "Good morning, officers," Judge Harrison replied with a polite smile. "I'm here for the Judicial Convention. I have my credentials right here." He held out his federal judge ID card and convention pass, both clearly visible. The laminated cards caught the sunlight, the official seals and his photograph plainly displayed. Officer Thompson squinted at the credentials from several feet away, not bothering to come closer for a proper look. Those could be fake. We've had problems with people trying to sneak into events like this before. Judge Harrison maintained his composure, though he felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he got whenever he encountered this kind of situation. "I assure you these are legitimate. I'm Judge Harrison from the Federal District Court. I'm scheduled to speak on a panel this afternoon about judicial reform." "Look, I don't care what those cards say," Officer Bradley interrupted, his voice growing louder. "You need to step back from this entrance. There's a public entrance around the corner you can use." A few convention attendees began to notice the confrontation. Some slowed their pace, watching from a distance. Judge Harrison recognized a couple of them, fellow judges he had worked with on various cases over the years. But they seemed hesitant to intervene, perhaps assuming this was just a routine security check. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job," Judge Harrison said calmly, "but I've been attending this convention for over a decade. This is the designated entrance for speakers and judges. If you'd like to verify my credentials, I'd be happy to wait while you contact convention security." The officers exchanged glances. Something unspoken passed between them, a look Judge Harrison had seen too many times before. It was the look that said they had already made up their minds about who he was and where he belonged, regardless of what his credentials might say. Officer Thompson took a step closer, his hand now resting on his equipment belt. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to step away from this entrance. If you refuse to comply, we'll have to consider it trespassing." Judge Harrison stood his ground, not out of defiance, but out of principle. He had spent his career upholding the law, fighting for justice, and ensuring that everyone received fair treatment under the Constitution. Now, standing outside a convention dedicated to those very ideals, he found himself facing the kind of discrimination he had worked so hard to eliminate from the justice system. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a federal judge who had presided over countless civil rights cases, being denied entry to a legal convention because two officers couldn't see past the color of his skin. The situation was about to escalate, and Judge Harrison knew it. But he also knew that sometimes standing up for what's right means standing your ground, even when it's uncomfortable. As more people began to gather, watching the scene unfold, Judge Harrison made a decision. He would not back down. He would not accept being treated as less than who he was. Little did he know that this moment would become a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone who would hear his story in the days to come. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing moment. Judge Harrison remained calm, though his heart was beating faster now. He had faced difficult situations in his courtroom many times, but this was different. This wasn't about law or justice. This was about something much more basic and painful. "Officers, I'm asking you to please look at my identification properly," Judge Harrison said, extending his credentials once more. "I have every right to enter through this door. My name is on the speaker list for today's convention." Officer Bradley's face hardened. "I don't need to look at anything. You're causing a disturbance, and you need to leave now." More people were stopping to watch. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something wasn't right. A woman in a business suit whispered to her colleague, "Isn't that Judge Harrison? I saw him speak at last year's conference." Judge Harrison took a deep breath, trying to de-escalate the situation. "I understand you have a job to do, but I also have a responsibility to be here today. I'm speaking on a panel about equal justice under the law. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding." Officer Thompson stepped forward aggressively. "The only misunderstanding is you thinking you can just walk in here like you own the place. I've seen plenty of people try to fake their way into these events." "But I'm not faking anything," Judge Harrison replied, his voice steady but firm. "I've served on the federal bench for 15 years. I've dedicated my life to upholding the law." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on the growing crowd. Here was a federal judge, someone who had sworn to protect the Constitution, being treated like a criminal for simply trying to enter a legal convention. Officer Bradley suddenly reached for Judge Harrison's arm. "That's it. You're being detained for trespassing and refusing to comply with lawful orders." Judge Harrison instinctively pulled back. "Please don't touch me. I haven't committed any crime. I'm simply trying to attend a convention where I'm scheduled to speak." The situation was spiraling out of control. Judge Harrison could see the anger in the officers' eyes, the way their bodies tensed, ready for confrontation. He knew from his years on the bench that this was the moment when things could go terribly wrong. "I'm going to reach for my phone to call convention security," Judge Harrison announced clearly, making sure everyone around could hear him. "They can verify my identity and resolve this peacefully." But as soon as his hand moved toward his pocket, Officer Thompson shouted, "He's reaching for something." Everything happened so fast after that. Officer Bradley lunged forward, grabbing Judge Harrison's arm and twisting it behind his back. The judge's phone clattered to the ground as he was pushed against the metal barrier. "Stop resisting!" Officer Thompson yelled, though Judge Harrison wasn't resisting at all. He was simply trying to maintain his balance as the officers manhandled him. The crowd gasped. Several people were now openly recording the incident. A young law student who recognized Judge Harrison from her textbooks shouted, "That's Judge Harrison. He's a federal judge. What are you doing?" But the officers weren't listening. They were caught up in their own narrative, seeing what they wanted to see rather than the reality in front of them. To them, Judge Harrison wasn't a respected member of the judiciary. He was just another black man who needed to be put in his place. Judge Harrison's mind raced. He knew that any sudden movement could be interpreted as resistance, potentially escalating the situation further. He had presided over enough police misconduct cases to know how quickly these encounters could turn deadly. "Officers, please," he said, his voice strained as his arm was twisted painfully behind his back. "I'm not resisting. I'm Judge Harrison from the Federal District Court. If you'll just contact the convention organizers." "Shut up," Officer Bradley barked, pressing harder against Judge Harrison's back. "You think claiming to be a judge makes this better? That's impersonating a federal official." The absurdity of the accusation would have been laughable if the situation weren't so dangerous. He was an actual federal judge being accused of impersonating himself, all because two officers couldn't see past their own prejudices. More convention attendees were gathering now. Some were calling out to the officers, trying to confirm Judge Harrison's identity. Others were on their phones, either recording or calling for help. The scene was becoming chaotic, with voices rising and tension mounting. Judge Harrison knew that this confrontation was about to get much worse. Despite his position, despite his credentials, despite the truth of who he was, these officers had already decided he didn't belong. And in their minds, that was all the justification they needed for what was about to happen next. The morning that had started with such promise was quickly turning into a nightmare. Judge Harrison had come to discuss justice, but instead, he was about to experience firsthand the very injustice he had spent his career fighting against. What happened next shocked everyone watching. Without warning, Officer Bradley swept Judge Harrison's legs from under him, sending the distinguished judge crashing to the hard concrete. The sound of his body hitting the ground echoed through the morning air, drawing gasps from the growing crowd. "Get on the ground! Stop resisting!" Officer Thompson shouted, even though Judge Harrison was already down and not fighting back at all. The judge's glasses flew off his face, skittering across the pavement. His expensive suit, pressed perfectly that morning, was now scraped against the rough concrete. Judge Harrison felt a sharp pain in his shoulder as Officer Bradley pressed his knee into his back. "Officers, please, I'm not resisting. I'm a federal judge," he managed to say, his voice strained from the pressure on his chest. But his words fell on deaf ears. Officer Thompson pulled out his baton, holding it threateningly. "Stop talking. You're under arrest for trespassing, resisting arrest, and impersonating a federal official." The crowd was growing larger by the second. People were shouting, pleading with the officers to stop. "That's really Judge Harrison," one woman cried out. "I've seen him in court. You're making a huge mistake." A young lawyer who had argued cases before Judge Harrison just last month pushed through the crowd. "Officers, I can confirm his identity. I'm an attorney with the district attorney's office. That man is federal Judge Harrison." But the officers were beyond listening. They were caught in a cycle of escalation, each action more aggressive than the last. Officer Bradley grabbed Judge Harrison's arms, yanking them behind his back with unnecessary force. The judge winced in pain but remained as still as possible, knowing that any movement could be used as an excuse for more violence. The scene was becoming more chaotic. Convention security guards were now rushing toward the commotion, their radios crackling with urgent messages. Hotel staff members were trying to manage the growing crowd while also calling for additional help. Judge Harrison's mind was racing. In all his years on the bench, he had never imagined he would be on this side of police brutality. He had read countless reports, heard testimony from victims, and ruled on cases involving excessive force, but experiencing it firsthand was something entirely different. Officer Thompson raised his baton. "Stop moving," he shouted, even though Judge Harrison was lying completely still. "I'm not moving," Judge Harrison replied, his face pressed against the concrete. "Please just verify my identity. Call the courthouse. Call anyone." The baton came down on Judge Harrison's leg, causing him to cry out in pain. The crowd reacted with horror. Several people were now on their phones, calling 911 to report police brutality. Others continued recording, capturing every moment of the assault. "This is insane," someone shouted. "He's not even resisting. Why are you hitting him?" Officer Bradley tightened the handcuffs until they dug into Judge Harrison's wrists. "You people need to back up. This is a police matter." But the crowd wasn't backing up. If anything, they were pressing closer, their phones held high, recording everything. The officers' actions were becoming more frantic, more desperate, as they realized they were being filmed from multiple angles. Judge Harrison could taste blood in his mouth where his face had hit the ground. His shoulder throbbed, his leg ached from the bacon strike, and his wrists burned from the too tight handcuffs. But worse than the physical pain was the humiliation of being treated this way in front of his peers, in front of people who respected him, people who had appeared in his courtroom. A security supervisor from the convention center finally pushed through the crowd. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying authority. "We're arresting this man for trespassing and impersonating a federal official," Officer Thompson replied, still holding his baton. The security supervisor looked down at Judge Harrison, and his eyes widened in recognition. "Oh my God, that's Judge Harrison. He's one of our keynote speakers. What have you done?" But the officers weren't ready to admit their mistake. Pride, prejudice, or perhaps just fear of consequences kept them from backing down. Instead, they doubled down on their actions. "He was resisting arrest," Officer Bradley insisted, even as dozens of phones captured evidence to the contrary. Judge Harrison lay on the ground, his dignity stripped away, his body aching, surrounded by people who knew exactly who he was but powerless to stop what was happening. The morning sun that had seemed so bright and promising now felt harsh and unforgiving. In the distance, sirens began to wail. More police were coming, but whether they would help or make things worse remained to be seen. The crowd held its collective breath, phones still recording, waiting to see what would happen next in this shocking display of injustice. The very system Judge Harrison had devoted his life to upholding was now failing him in the most public and painful way possible. And somewhere in the back of his mind, even through the pain and humiliation, he knew that this moment would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone who would see this video and realize that if this could happen to a federal judge, it could happen to anyone. Just when it seemed the situation couldn't get any worse, a black SUV with city government plates pulled up to the curb. The door opened and out stepped Mayor Rodriguez, a presence commanding immediate attention. She was scheduled to give the opening remarks at the convention, but nothing could have prepared her for the scene unfolding before her eyes. Mayor Rodriguez took one look at the man on the ground, and her face went from confusion to recognition to fury in a matter of seconds. "What in God's name is going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path for the mayor. Her security detail followed closely behind, their expressions grave as they assessed the situation. Mayor Rodriguez strode forward with purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "Officers, step away from that man immediately," she commanded, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority. Officers Bradley and Thompson looked up, startled by the mayor's sudden appearance. For the first time since the incident began, uncertainty flickered across their faces. Officer Bradley's knee was still pressed into Judge Harrison's back, while Officer Thompson stood with his baton still in hand. "Ma'am, we're in the middle of an arrest," Officer Bradley stammered, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "This man was trespassing and—" "That man is Federal Judge Harrison," Mayor Rodriguez interrupted, her voice rising with each word. "He's a respected member of our judicial system and my personal friend. What possible reason could you have for treating him like this?" The color drained from both officers' faces. The crowd, which had been recording everything, now captured the moment when realization dawned on the two officers. Their aggressive postures suddenly deflated, and Officer Bradley quickly removed his knee from Judge Harrison's back. "Your Honor, we didn't," Officer Thompson began, but words failed him. The baton in his hand now seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, and he let it drop to his side. Mayor Rodriguez knelt beside Judge Harrison, her expression softening with concern. "Jerome, are you all right? Can you hear me?" Judge Harrison nodded weakly, relief washing over him at the sound of a familiar voice. "Rodriguez, thank you," he managed to say, his voice hoarse from having his face pressed against the concrete. "Get these handcuffs off him right now," the mayor ordered, standing back up to face the officers. Her security detail moved closer, creating a protective barrier around the scene. Officer Bradley fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the handcuffs. The metal restraints had left angry red marks on Judge Harrison's wrists. As soon as his hands were free, several people rushed forward to help him sit up. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor," Officer Bradley mumbled, unable to meet the judge's eyes. "We didn't know, we thought." "You thought what?" Mayor Rodriguez demanded. "That a well-dressed black man couldn't possibly be a federal judge. That he must be lying about his identity despite showing you proper credentials." The officers stood in silence, their earlier bravado completely gone. They looked like children caught in a terrible misdeed, which in many ways they were. The crowd continued filming, capturing every moment of their humiliation. Judge Harrison slowly got to his feet with help from the mayor and several bystanders. His suit was torn, his face was scraped, and he moved stiffly from the assault. But he maintained his dignity, straightening his jacket and accepting his glasses from someone who had retrieved them from the ground. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Mayor Rodriguez asked, her concern evident. "I'll be all right," Judge Harrison replied, though he winced as he moved his shoulder. "Nothing broken, at least." The mayor turned back to the officers, her fury reigniting. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This man has served our justice system with honor for 15 years. He's presided over cases that have shaped our understanding of civil rights. And you assaulted him because you couldn't be bothered to look at his identification properly." Convention security, hotel management, and more city officials were now arriving at the scene. The head of convention security approached, looking mortified. "Judge Harrison, I cannot express how sorry we are. This is absolutely unacceptable." Judge Harrison nodded, still processing everything that had happened. The physical pain was one thing, but the emotional impact of being treated like a criminal simply because of his skin color cut much deeper. "These officers need to be removed from duty immediately," Mayor Rodriguez declared. "And I want a full investigation into this incident." Officers Bradley and Thompson stood frozen, their faces pale as they began to comprehend the magnitude of their actions. They had not only assaulted an innocent man, but a federal judge, someone who understood the law better than they ever would. The consequences of their prejudice and poor judgment were about to come crashing down on them. As more officials arrived and the crowd continued to grow, one thing became crystal clear. This incident would not be swept under the rug. Too many people had witnessed it, too many phones had recorded it, and too many powerful voices were now involved. The officers' actions had been exposed in the harsh light of day, and there would be no escaping accountability. The crowd around them had grown to over 100 people, with more arriving every minute. News of the incident had spread through the convention center like wildfire, and now judges, lawyers, and legal professionals from across the country were witnessing the aftermath of what had just occurred. Mayor Rodriguez stood tall beside Judge Harrison, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want everyone here to understand what just happened. This is Federal Judge Jerome Harrison, a man who has served our justice system with distinction for over 15 years. He was assaulted by these officers while trying to enter this convention where he is a scheduled speaker." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People who hadn't seen the initial confrontation were now learning the full scope of what had transpired. Several prominent attorneys stepped forward, confirming Judge Harrison's identity and expressing their outrage. Judge Harrison, still recovering from the ordeal, addressed the crowd with remarkable composure. "Thank you all for your concern. What happened here today is unfortunately not unique. It's a reality that many people face every day, though usually without witnesses or video evidence." Officers Bradley and Thompson stood off to the side, their heads hanging low. They had removed their sunglasses, and their faces showed a mixture of shame, fear, and growing realization of the consequences they would face. "Your Honor," Officer Bradley finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper, We made a terrible mistake. We should have looked at your credentials more carefully." "A mistake?" Mayor Rodriguez interjected sharply. "This wasn't a mistake. This was prejudice in action. You saw a black man and immediately assumed he didn't belong here." The officers shifted uncomfortably. Officer Thompson cleared his throat. "Our body cameras, they seem to have malfunctioned during the incident." A collective groan rose from the crowd. Everyone knew what that meant. The officers were already trying to cover their tracks, but they had forgotten one crucial detail in their panic. "That won't be necessary," said a young woman stepping forward with her phone. "I recorded everything from the moment they'd first stopped Judge Harrison." More voices joined in. "I have video too. I started recording when they pushed him to the ground. I captured the entire assault." The officers' faces grew even paler as they realized the extent of the evidence against them. In today's world, everyone with a smartphone was a potential witness, and their actions had been captured from multiple angles. Mayor Rodriguez turned to her security detail. "Please collect contact information from anyone who has video evidence. We'll need it for the investigation." Judge Harrison, despite his injuries, maintained his professional demeanor. "I want to be clear about something," he said, addressing both the crowd and the officers. "This isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows these kinds of encounters to happen far too often. How many people have faced similar treatment without the benefit of witnesses or my position to protect them?" His words resonated deeply with the crowd. Many nodded in agreement, understanding that what they had witnessed was a symptom of a much larger problem. The head of the police department arrived on the scene, having been summoned by urgent calls from City Hall. Chief Williams took one look at the situation and immediately understood the gravity of what had occurred. "Officers Bradley and Thompson, you are hereby suspended pending a full investigation," Chief Williams announced. "Hand over your badges and service weapons immediately." The officers complied silently, their hands trembling as they surrendered their badges. The The metallic clink of the badges hitting the chief's palm seemed to echo in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the crowd. Judge Harrison, Chief Williams continued, "On behalf of the entire department, I offer our sincerest apologies. This behavior does not reflect our values or our training." Judge Harrison nodded but remained stern. "Chief Williams, apologies are a start, but what we need is systemic change. These officers felt empowered to act this way. We need to examine why." The convention organizers had now set up a podium near the entrance. They invited Judge Harrison to speak, recognizing that this moment had become something much bigger than the planned conference agenda. As Judge Harrison approached the podium, supported by Mayor Rodriguez, the crowd parted respectfully. Camera phones continued to record, but now they were capturing something different, not an assault, but a moment of truth and accountability. "What happened to me today?" Judge Harrison began, his voice steady despite his obvious pain, "happens to countless others who don't have my position or platform. Today, you all became witnesses. The question now is, what will we do with this knowledge?" The crowd listened intently as Judge Harrison transformed his personal trauma into a call for justice. The very convention that was meant to discuss legal matters had become a real-life demonstration of why their work was so important. In the background, Officers Bradley and Thompson were led away by internal affairs investigators. Their faces showed they finally understood the full weight of their actions. They had not only assaulted a federal judge, but had also exposed the deep-rooted problems within their department for all the world to see. The videos were already being uploaded to social media, and within hours, the story would spread across the nation. What started as a routine morning had become a watershed moment in the ongoing conversation about justice, prejudice, and accountability in America. Within hours, the videos of Judge Harrison's assault had spread across social media like wildfire. News channels picked up the story, and by evening, it was the leading headline on every major network. The footage was clear and undeniable. A federal judge, beaten and humiliated by police officers who refused to acknowledge his identity. Judge Harrison sat in his hospital room, his shoulder wrapped in bandages and his face showing bruises from the concrete. Despite the doctor's advice to rest, he insisted on giving a statement to the press. His wife, Patricia, stood by his side, holding his hand as cameras filled the room. "Today, I experienced what too many people in our country face regularly," Judge Harrison began, his voice steady despite the pain medication. "The difference is that I had witnesses, I had video evidence, and I had a position that eventually protected me. Many others don't have these advantages." The hospital room fell silent as reporters hung on his every word. His dignity, even in this moment of vulnerability, commanded respect. Meanwhile, the police department was in crisis mode. Chief Williams held an emergency press conference, flanked by city officials and internal affairs investigators. "The actions of Officers Bradley and Thompson were inexcusable," he declared. "They have been suspended without pay, and we are pursuing immediate termination." But the story was bigger than just two officers. Protesters had already gathered outside the police station, demanding systemic changes. They carried signs reading "Justice for Judge Harrison," and "If they do this to a judge, what about us?" The FBI announced they were opening a civil rights investigation. The Department of Justice issued a statement expressing grave concern about the incident. Legal experts on television debated the various charges the officers could face: assault, violation of civil rights, abuse of power. By the next morning, both officers had hired attorneys. Through their lawyers, they issued carefully worded apologies, but the damage was done. The video evidence was overwhelming, and their claim about malfunctioning body cameras only made them look worse. Civil rights organizations jumped into action. The NAACP announced they would be filing a formal complaint. The American Civil Liberties Union offered their support to Judge Harrison. Legal scholars began writing op-eds about the incident, calling it a textbook case of racial profiling. At the convention center, the organizers decided to dedicate an entire session to discussing the incident. What was supposed to be a routine legal conference had transformed into a moment of national reckoning. Judges and attorneys who had planned to discuss theoretical legal concepts were now grappling with a very real example of injustice. Mayor Rodriguez appeared on national morning shows, using the platform to call for comprehensive police reform. "This isn't just about two bad officers," she explained. "This is about a culture that allows this behavior to flourish. We need better training, better accountability, and a complete overhaul of how we approach community policing." The police union initially tried to defend the officers, releasing a statement about the difficult decisions officers must make in the field. But as more details emerged and public outrage grew, even the union backed away from supporting Bradley and Thompson. Corporate sponsors of the Judicial Convention issued statements condemning the assault. Several major law firms announced pro bono initiatives to help victims of police misconduct. The legal community, often seen as removed from street-level justice issues, was mobilizing in unprecedented ways. Judge Harrison's colleagues from courts across the country sent messages of support. Retired Supreme Court justices weighed in on the implications of the assault. Law schools began planning seminars on racial bias in law enforcement. The City Council called an emergency meeting to discuss police oversight. They proposed creating a civilian review board with real power to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. The proposal, which had languished for years, suddenly had momentum. Back in his hospital room, Judge Harrison received a call from the governor, who expressed his shock and promised state-level investigations. Congressional representatives began drafting letters demanding federal oversight of the police department. As the sun set on the second day after the incident, vigils were held outside the convention center. Hundreds of people gathered with candles, singing songs of justice and solidarity. Judge Harrison watched from his hospital window, moved by the outpouring of support. The incident had sparked something larger than anyone could have anticipated. What began as a morning of injustice was becoming a catalyst for change. Organizations that rarely worked together were now united in demanding accountability and reform. Officers Bradley and Thompson, watching the news from their homes, began to understand that their actions had consequences far beyond their own careers. They had become the face of a problem America could no longer ignore. Their moment of prejudice had opened the nation's eyes to injustices that happened every day, usually without cameras rolling or judges involved. The reverberations of that morning would be felt for years to come. Judge Harrison's bruises would heal, but the impact of his experience would help reshape discussions about justice, equality, and accountability across the nation. The convention that was meant to discuss the future of law had instead become a turning point in the fight for true justice. 6 months later, the federal courthouse was packed to capacity. Officers Bradley and Thompson sat at the defendant's table, their once proud uniforms replaced by simple suits. The charges against them were serious: violation of civil rights, assault under color of authority, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Judge Harrison, now fully recovered from his injuries, sat in the gallery. He had recused himself from any involvement in the case, but he wanted to witness the proceedings. His presence sent a powerful message. This wasn't about revenge, but about justice and accountability. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The video evidence was played repeatedly, each viewing causing the defendants to sink lower in their chairs. Witnesses testified about what they saw that morning. Expert witnesses explained how racial bias influences police behavior, even unconsciously. The officers' defense attorneys tried various strategies. They claimed their clients felt threatened, that they were following training, that it was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing, both officers addressed the court. Officer Bradley spoke first, his voice breaking. "I've had 6 months to think about what I did. I let my prejudices control my actions. I betrayed my badge, my training, and most importantly, I hurt an innocent man. I'm truly sorry." Officer Thompson followed. "I've lost everything: my career, my reputation, my freedom. But I understand now that Judge Harrison lost something that day too: his sense of safety and dignity. No apology can undo that, but I am genuinely remorseful." The judge sentenced them to 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. They were also ordered to complete extensive civil rights training and perform community service upon release. But the story didn't end in the courtroom. The incident had sparked real change across the country. The police department implemented mandatory bias training for all officers. Body camera policies were strengthened, with severe penalties for malfunctions during critical incidents. Judge Harrison used his platform to advocate for reform. He traveled to law schools, police academies, and community centers, sharing his story and promoting understanding. His message was always the same. This isn't about demonizing all police officers, it's about creating a system where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. The city established a civilian oversight board with real investigative powers. Similar boards were created in cities across the nation, inspired by what had happened. Police departments nationwide reviewed their training procedures, particularly regarding implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. Congress passed the Judge Harrison Act, which mandated federal oversight for police departments with patterns of civil rights violations. The law also provided funding for better training and community policing initiatives. Law schools added new courses on racial justice and police accountability. The American Bar Association created guidelines for addressing systemic bias in the justice system. Young lawyers, inspired by Judge Harrison's dignity in the face of injustice, chose careers in civil rights law. A year after the incident, a memorial plaza was dedicated outside the convention center where it all happened. The plaza featured a statue symbolizing justice and equality, with a plaque telling the story of that fateful morning. It became a gathering place for peaceful protests and community discussions about justice. Judge Harrison returned to the bench, but he was changed. His rulings reflected an even deeper understanding of the challenges faced by ordinary citizens in their encounters with law enforcement. He became known for his fair but firm approach to police misconduct cases. The two former officers, after serving their sentences, dedicated themselves to speaking out against racial profiling. They visited police academies, sharing their story as a cautionary tale. Their transformation from perpetrators to advocates showed that change was possible, even for those who had been part of the problem. Schools began teaching about the incident as a case study in civil rights and social justice. Children learned about the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their appearance. Parents used the story to discuss difficult topics like prejudice and privilege with their kids. 5 years later, at the annual Judicial Convention, Judge Harrison delivered the keynote address. He spoke about forgiveness, growth, and the ongoing work of justice. That morning, I experienced the worst of what our system can do, he said. But in the aftermath, I saw the best of what we can become when we demand accountability and commit to change. The convention center erupted in a standing ovation. Among those applauding were police officers, judges, lawyers, and ordinary citizens. They understood that while the journey toward true justice was far from over, that terrible morning had brought them all one step closer to the ideals they claimed to cherish. Judge Harrison's assault had become more than just a news story. It had become a turning point in American history, a moment when the nation was forced to confront its prejudices and choose a better path forward. The scars remained, but they served as reminders of how far they'd come and how far they still needed to go.